Museums. Run risk, like having an artist curate from your collection. Loan works to area institutions, and ignore your board on occasion. You are the paid professionals. These artists you live in community with, exhibit their work, produce catalogs so the word goes out, collect their work so all artists and community can be raised up and educated. And community members, get involved with local artists and arts organizations. You, all of us, are the audience, the recipients of what artists and museums do. We are the beneficiary. This gift of art is a blessing to all of us. Change has arrived, thank God, and hope is abundant now. Yes, we can has flowed into yes, we did. It's time for all of us to do the good work that has been given to us and to now say, yes, we will. Thank you.
Give my fellow panelists a moment just to slide around if they want to orient to the screen, and perhaps a chance to dim the stage lights. Someone could take a quick look at that. So I'd like to start with just a few comments and then take a really broad view of what I think is going on, at least according to my observations of museum practice in North America right now. The first is unquestionably to recognize the number of institutions that have accepted Brancusi's quote, which is that architecture is an inhabitable art. And to recognize the Bilbao effect and all the kind of downstream exuberance of that, and then perhaps pulling back from that, as we've seen, for example, in Kansas City with Stephen Holt's work at the Nelson Atkins. So I want to kind of cover that gamut and offer some observations as we go. But I also want to start by saying I think museum architecture is a fine art. I accept Brancusi's proposal that it's an inhabitable sculpture, and but it's also about community, and it's about creating a sense of place, and it's about creating a cultural center that everyone can enjoy. So to have this dialogue about what's going on now, what is the relationship between art and the building envelope that surrounds it that we call architecture, I want to just maybe step back a bit and go through some historical cycles to say maybe this is not a new dialogue, but an evolving dialogue. Certainly one can look back to early museum models such as salons and scuolas in Italy, etc., where palatial scale rooms that were originally designed for other purposes eventually became art hanging places. And then one can move on to the late 19th and early 20th century museums here in the States and start to look at cultural temples and the architecture that was meant to achieve a grandness of scale, yet somehow I think in this grandness create a sense of overwhelming presence that excludes the individual interpretation and the sense of community within that institution. We can move on to mid-century, a period that I call the fortress or the repository for art. Architecture started to take on, even out of the famous offices in New York, a real fortress-like quality, reflective glass that you couldn't see past into the lobby, a lack of awareness of the interior functions and operations of the building because it was so turning its back on the street and on public viewing. And then certainly a couple of buildings I think broke clearly free from that mold. The first, or an earliest version, the Pompidou Center, and then later the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, where became a transformation of this fortress-like quality and arrived at exuberance and a transparency of operations and adjacencies to urban spaces and plazas and cafes and all the things that that transition from this internal understanding of an institution to an external understanding of it, thinking of it like an anchor in a village, a community anchor, if you will, much like universities are, or much like other very large institutions perform this kind of more complex social fabric and interweaving of events. And so museums started doing that. And so to me, that's those kind of sequence maybe of 4 different periods of recognizing that architectural role is the spring point for talking about where we are today. And this simple statement, today museums and cultural institutions are recognizing their expanding roles and realizing that an intensified synergy is possible between the museum and the community. And one can pause for a moment and say that with the financial difficulties we're having now, that programs are going on hold, but in the long term, I think, assuming that there's a national recovery from where we are now, that these values will be the springboard for reestablishing those programs and cultural life and visual arts life coming back to the forefront. So I'm going to talk about a few characteristics of buildings that fit that statement that I just made. And the first is recognizing institutional identity and iconic community presence, and the fact that that can be communicated through a museum's architecture. This is the Talman Museum that was just opened in Roanoke, and a project that Judy helped inform through programming and through laying the foundations of a board and a community that was ready to make this happen before she went on to D.C. This is an image of the Hunter Museum. It's an addition exactly 100 years after the original 1905 mansion. A very contemporary building that also is accompanied by a new sculpture garden, which has been turned over to the public realm for 24/7 access, linked to a new pedestrian bridge to the downtown aquarium, tying in on one side to the aquarium and the downtown business district, and the other to a river walk that links to the UT Chattanooga campus. So really this domain, which used to be a private isolated parking lot for the old mansion, is now essentially a thoroughfare in which community activity takes place all the time. Another view of the Hunter Museum, the idea of integrating public spaces throughout a building's footprint and the way it engages its site. You can see from this view a series of view terraces, some public, some private, or some that are within the ticketed realm of the institution, etc. But nonetheless, really breaking down the scale of a building so that its exterior is very usable and very welcoming. Also the notion, this goes back to the Taubman, the idea that a lobby can be understood as a living room for the institution and perhaps even a living room for the community. There's a trend toward keeping these lobbies non-ticketed. And even one example, Milwaukee, they've actually right now, in the last 3 to 6 months, have started looking at converting their lobby to a ticket-free space in the building. It's so popular, yet there's a sense of frustration of lack of access to that to some visitors. Beyond that, there are other public spaces weaving their way into the full program of a museum, including concourses to galleries that can be used for special events, auditoriums that can serve both multimedia type events, in this case showing a conventional lecture as well as a dance going on, and often even the co-joining of lobbies and auditoriums so that they can serve as pre-function to events in the adjacent space.